Thank you, B. I want to introduce our amazing panelists for the night. We have Sua Ara. She is a filmmaker, Palestinian American, and she's done a lot of work in bridging communities. So welcome, Sua. We have our brother Musa Said. He's also a filmmaker, an educator. He's done work with TFI in the past as a teaching artist, and so we welcome you. We have Kathy. How do you pronounce your last name? I'm bad. Hegel. All right. Let me just say this. I make everybody's name a Latin American name. So I gotta constantly ask, how do you pronounce your name? Kathy's a poet. She's also an organizer. She's done a lot of work around gender equality, domestic violence, internationally and nationally. So let us welcome Kathy Hengel. And last but not least, we have Rodrigo Brandal. Did I say that right?
Perfect. Yeah.
Ah,
and no one ever does. So.
I got it right. And he's vice president of marketing and publicity at Kino Lober & Company. So let's just welcome the panelists. You know, you clap when you welcome people. You do the clapping motion. All righty then. All right. So we know that this was a heavy topic and a heavy story to watch. Especially, I know that I get very sensitive when it comes to children. And we saw the story parallelly with Jabral, who was 5 by the end of the story. And so we want to give you an opportunity to talk about your impressions of the film, but we're going to have the panelists do that first. So I want to ask, what are your impressions on the film? And we could move the mic however you want. They all have mics. So you want
okay.
There you go. You can use my mic.
Oh, do I have to go first? Oh, okay. So for me, so my family is from Kashmir, which has similarly been in a conflict for the last, since 47, so around the same time. And so I grew up going to these protests and seeing images of, these funeral marches and so forth, and just violence, images of, militants and all these things. So but it was never made sense to me growing up, and it was something that I think, in a way, because I was born and raised in America, I saw these images the way that probably most Americans do. It's like, oh, angry, violent brown people, and it's totally decontextualized. So, as I grew up, I got to go back and start to understand what's going on there on the ground. And I think this film is really just an amazing example of how it doesn't provide the full context of the whole conflict, but it really, for me, with the time that was spent there, obviously he lives there, but just the time that was spent documenting this gave so much more context to these images, and it gave a more holistic perspective, even if it's not, of the whole conflict or of, it doesn't represent everything in the Palestinian movement. It's just, for me, it was just like a master class in how to actually talk about this issue in a very real and human way. And, because in the Arab Spring also, at first, it was framed as like chaos. But once we started to actually have voices from the ground explain it to, people here, it started to take a shape that, people weren't seeing because we're, not informed. So for me, it's just something the film is sort of like a paragon to aspire to in terms of how to contextualize and how to, provide shape to these things which we usually willfully sort of ignore or are misinformed about.
Go ahead.
No, I'm always just I've seen this film a couple of times before, but I'm always very surprised at how this film reminds me of the power, not just to bear witness, but to the power of, and the importance of narrating and creating narration and sort of telling yourself your own story, telling the world your own story, and sort of creating their argument for yourself about the reality that you live and sort of really reflecting on your own existence. It's also, it's sort of so hard not to connect with what's happening in the United States and in the world, and sort of, this constant struggle that, and how to resist, what does resistance look like, and also what are the tools that power, that sort of states or institutions are using to control population and sort of redefine who we are for ourselves, because it makes power more easy for them to sort of enact. So I don't know. I think it's, in a way, it's about Palestinians and Israelis, of course, and it's about this family, but it's also about a struggle that is, I hate to say that word, but universal. I mean, it really is about things that we are experiencing in New York, in the United States, in Brazil, all over the world.
I've been involved with the struggle for the sovereignty of the Palestinian people since 1982. I also grew up, my dad was a documentary filmmaker, so I grew up sort of experiencing the power of story through film. And when my older daughter was 3, I went to Palestine, and I just kept thinking about, in watching the film, about all the children I have heard from and seen and been connected to in war zones, and then my daughter saying to me, "Mommy, don't die." But I came home, and I could come home, and I could write about it. And I understand that the theme is the resilience of communities, or building resilient communities and resilience. And the stunning quality of this film to me is the resilience of the story, and the way a story, the teller of the story, the voice, the truth, the experience, the authenticity, and the heart is resilient beyond anything. It lives on through the camera, through the voice, through the images, through the friendships, and nothing can take that away, even when the camera is broken. So, to me, as a poet, the film is a beautiful poem. It is what survives in some sense, which is the story, and why we make things. We make things to keep the story alive. So I'm really grateful. I really didn't want to say anything, because it does what a great work does. It does its job. But I'm grateful to be with everyone here, listening and watching and carrying it on.
Hi. So, yeah, I mean, it's always hard for me to watch this film, or actually any reality on the ground in Palestine or anywhere there's a real struggle and people fighting for their basic human rights. And I think, it's living in this country, being Palestinian American, it's easy to kind of shut it out as you wish. I mean, I'm not Black, so I don't have to be Black every single day. I get to pick when I want to go in and out of it. But this always brings you back. And I think I had a moment when I was in Palestine, and I was with some of my cousins who are I'm pretty American, but they're even more American than me, don't speak much of the language. And we had a taxi driver driving us from Ramallah to the Dead Sea, which is in Israel proper. And the cab driver was telling a story of how he was imprisoned and tortured. And I was just mechanically, he would be talking, and I would be turning back to them and translating what he was saying. And I'd heard the story so many times before. I mean, almost every Palestinian man has been in prison at some point for no good reason other than he's a Palestinian man. So when I turned around, I noticed my cousin was crying, and I was like, oh, damn, when did I? You lose your humanity at some point. You see this so many times. And I think this this kind of film contextualizes things in a way that brings it back to the reality. Where for me, like, we see a lot of the protests and the funerals on TV for like 1 second clip, and people look angry, and here you get to see why. Or like seeing him put up the posters of Fia was really moving, because we don't have that kind of background moment of what happened before that poster came up. So I think film is a great way to put it into context. And I know all you guys are probably here because you're in solidarity in some way, and are going to take this message into the classroom and further on. So I think, anything we can do to help equip you further, not that anyone knows anything, any real answer, but I think the fact that we're all in this together trying to make a difference is really important.
Thank you. So we know, obviously, right, that different sides will have different narratives. And I was sharing earlier about my trip to Ferguson and how I really do believe that the corporate media does their job to serve corporations. And so they serve more as secretaries or stenographers for corporations. And that's unfortunate. My question to you all is, what is the role of the media in social, political, and historical moments or experiences or events, such as Ferguson and such as the Palestinian struggle? What is the role of media? And most of you, if not all of you, are doing independent work. So you could speak from that space.
I think it's the reason I'm in film is to tell the story, because I think if it's not out there. And growing up, hearing the Palestinian narrative on TV, I was like, that's not true, that's a lie, and just constantly being frustrated. And I think all of us have probably experienced that with some situation that we're very intimate with, and seeing what the narrative told versus what we know. So I think it's our job to always document and always put it out there. I think it's a powerful force, and I think we have to infiltrate the corporate media as well.
I guess what I feel my role is to the way that the collaboration in this film worked, I think, is really an interesting example of also what I think is the future and is what is happening more and more, where you have, someone who has access to resources, funding, but also trained in, media making and storytelling, collaborating really with someone on the ground who, really knows the story intimately. And so in my own work, I try to do these sort of community-based productions where I spent, months. I can't afford years, I guess, the way that Imad obviously has invested in his film, but you spend I try to spend at least a few months with the community, and not with the camera on hardly at all, but just really building those relationships to where then when the film is made, they have ownership of it, and and we both are invested in it in a very intimate way. And it's not just about the story that I want to tell, but it's about finding what their buy-in is into the story, and making sure that they get some of their investment back. So yeah, that's what my role, I think, is just to be able to create more of those collaborations, especially with people that are not have the same privilege that I have to tell stories. Even though I feel even in this media landscape, I might still be at the bottom of the food chain or whatever, but I still have infinitely more access to more resources and things than people in Kashmir, people in Palestine have. And I just wonder how many Imad Bernat are in the world that just haven't been discovered, and who have been trying to tell their story, and it's unfortunate they have to wait for someone like us to be able to find them. But that's just I think that's why I consider it my responsibility to do that.
I think one thing is to expand our definition of what the media is. Certainly, and I worked for years as a consultant with progressive groups on getting their story into the media, and there's the pressure of the corporate media. That's one thing to do. We can't all do the same thing. And then there's our own production. But that can take many, many forms. And I guess I want to speak now as an educator, and that I really encourage my students in a program called Art and Public Policy, but also young people I work with in community groups, whatever the form is, and it may change, to share and to believe in their voices and their stories and their versions of their truths, individually, collaboratively, across boundaries, that we become the media. And that's a kind of a power that we hope to claim and continue to claim. The corporate media, people will do their jobs, and those who are going to be the thorn in that side, that's important. It's really important. At the same time, the more that we produce our own versions of the world in multiplicity of ways, I think the more walls come down.
I don't know, I think it's a big question, but I think it's, in some ways it's important for us to sort of struggle to reclaim the media, to reclaim the spaces that are out there, but it's also important for us to know that sometimes it's more important to just tell a different story, or to tell the story differently, or to tell a kind of truth that needs to be told, even if it's not going to be a story that's going to, make a big splash, or be the big story of the month. I think that when we start competing with the big media, it sort of becomes problematic. I think this film, for instance, looks very simple, but it isn't. It's actually very constructed and very complex and very sort of beautifully sort of put together. It's really a movie made with sort of footage from everyday life that tells a big story and a very lyrical story. So I don't know. I think that even as I worked on the release of this film, there were moments that we sort of had to sort of scale back and say, like, we don't want to sort of just be another story about a Palestinian and Israeli collaborating, or just about a victim of war. We want to tell a different story. So let's find a way to tell that story. That's what's important for us. And yeah, there was a moment when we were in LA, and when Ahmad was sort of, there was a moment where he was detained at the border, and Michael Moore started tweeting about him. It was this sort of surreal moment. And I woke up and there were 300 emails on my account. Everyone wanted to talk to him, and we took him to TMZ, and we thought, this is a moment for us to go and sort of really claim a big space, and sort of when will TMZ ever cover a Palestinian filmmaker again, ever? So, and people on the streets, they recognize him. They were like, it's the Broken Cameras guy, and that was sort of beautiful too, to sort of take a small story and sort of, but Guy Davidi especially, and Guy Davidi, this film doesn't have a Israeli perspective, but he as an artist and as an activist is in the film in every frame. And he was always sort of, asking us, is this the story that we want to tell, Because there's an easy story and then there's the real story. And I think we have to make those choices all the time.
Just to go on what you were saying, Rodrigo, in terms of making choices, there's a moment that comes when you have those stories, right? And you try to figure out whether that's the route you want to go, because if you go the route of telling the real story, it might be very difficult for you in many different ways. We see that with Iman. His life was threatened. He was jailed, And so I would like to ask the panelists if there's been ever a moment where you felt, because of the work that you've been doing, that your life or your career has been threatened.
I'm not as brave as Imad or anyone that's been at the front lines, but and I don't know. I don't know if I have what it takes to do that. There was a moment, a story that I'll share. My life was definitely not threatened, but the reality of the situation was very clear. Where I went to Palestine to do a short narrative film in the village that my parents are from. And because it was narrative, it was all constructed, and we had actors and crew, and it was all set up. But that was a whole experience in itself, and my goal was to create a bubble around the film and not acknowledge the occupation, because I needed to go in there, make a film, and come out. And I knew that if we got kind of involved in what was really happening on the ground, I wasn't going to come out of there with a film, because things like deadlines or day-to-day life are just impossible there. And so we were kind of going against that. And then I didn't want to hear it as an excuse either. I mean, I didn't, because the train system here, it's oh, the checkpoint was backed up, and it's okay, and it's real, it's very real, because you'll be at a checkpoint for 4 to 7 hours, but you can also use that as an excuse on an off day when things are a little bit calmer. And so I know that sounds horrible, but so one day I just was going to Ramallah, another town, for hours worth of meetings and casting, and I was of course late, and I was at one of the main cross streets in Bethlehem where I was staying, and the UN was dropping off all their kind of wheat and grains, and it's quite humiliating to see people picking up their food from the UN, their charity. And I saw this old lady picking up bags of wheat or rice or whatever it was, haggling with a cab driver. And so I asked her, I'm where are you going? Let me take you there. And she was going exactly the opposite direction that I was going. I was I can't take you. And so I felt horrible, right? So the occupation was kind of creeping into my day. So we go to our meetings, we can't get into Ramallah because it's blocked off for some holiday or another, whatever lie the soldiers were telling us. It's funny because when you're in that situation, I just started screaming at them, you're lying, you can't block off a whole city, and this whole thing. And so we ended up driving all around, had our whole day, which was all messed up, but at the end of the day, we were driving back at 11 at night, and the checkpoint was super, super backed up. And I was with my producer, who's Palestinian and lives there, and I'm is this normal? Because it was also Ramadan, so take whatever Palestine life and times the hecticness, multiple, because it's Ramadan. And so the traffic was super backed up, and I'm is this normal? She's yeah, it's Ramadan. And I'm I don't think it's normal, it's never this far back. And she's oh, you're right. So the Israeli soldiers were throwing tear gas. And we were literally in bumper to bumper, 6 lanes worth of traffic. And she's turn around. I'm I can't even move the wheel without hitting the car in front of me right now. And I didn't know how we were going to get out of it, which was fine. We didn't have to get out of it. But what happened in that moment was really interesting, because I'd kind of been disrespecting the occupation in a way. I've kind of been we're ignoring it. It's not happening. We got to make this film, right? And in that moment where we needed to turn around, literally seas parted and cars moved, and men got out of their cars to help our little car, move out. And literally they cleared a path for us to get out, because we had yellow license plates, which allowed us to go through Israel proper. And it was so interesting in that moment to me, because I saw community come together. That whole what makes society so dysfunctional on a day-to-day level, when it's real, when people have to come together, they absolutely do. And it was such a small example. There was no real threat, but just to see the beauty of people coming together in the moment that it matters. And I think that's what Palestinian life is based on, that's what community is based on, and that's the only reason people have survived this long, is through each other, because we need each other. And it was really beautiful and humbling, just that tiny little moment. So,
yeah. When I made my first feature, Valley of Saints, it's set in Kashmir, and I had spent all this time again gaining access to this community on this beautiful lake, and I had sort of not consciously also decided not to directly talk about the conflict, and just sort of have it be on the periphery, because the time that I had spent there also, the soldiers are always there and there's a military occupation, but the time I had spent there was relatively peaceful. But then right before we went into production, a teenage boy was killed by the Indian Army, and it started the cycle of protests and more killings until finally the city was put on lockdown and curfew. And this is like right when we were supposed to start shooting. So there was the question of should we go still or not? And all my family was telling me not to go. This is not the appropriate time to make a film, and it's dangerous and so forth. And my family, they had been, you couldn't leave your house basically for weeks on end. So I decided though to go. I had a grant that was going to expire within a few months, so I kind of like felt, some urgency on that end, but also just like I realized if I really wanted, this is the reality of this place, and if I decide to go when it's, all sunshine next summer or something, then that's not going to be the reality of what's going on right now. And so we went and we restructured. I threw out the script that we had written initially. I wrote a 3-page outline, and we just like made note cards of each scene and put them on the wall. And whenever we could shoot one of them, we would shoot one and then just take it off the wall. And we ended up, it was supposed to be a 1-month production. We stayed there for 3 months. It was just me, my producer, and my cinematographer that came from America. And then we ended up casting all locally, which we hadn't planned on before. The film was then all in Kashmiri language, which wasn't also planned. And we just tried to, I also, again, didn't try to put everyone in danger by always going out and shooting the stuff that we were not supposed to be shooting, but we shot enough of it to just, make it part of the experience of being there, because we were feeling it. I mean, we couldn't leave this lake that we were in because of the checkpoints and things like that. So I think it's, important to, have some skin in the game, because a lot of storytellers or filmmakers from here, will often just parachute into another place for however long, get what we need to get, and get out of there. And that's the typical sort of news mindset of how to produce these stories, or just have a stringer there. But I think you have to feel some of that fear, I think. And to see Imad, and it was just amazing to me to watch the film. And I was in tears most of the time, not at the sad parts, but also at the moments of vitality and levity, because it was just to know that people are able to hold on to that part of themselves, because I was going crazy in 3 months of being in Kashmir, and I was, had my dark moments, but just to see this, to see that resilience, and to see that, there's still joy and hope after, but I think, again, it's important that you do have to sort of recenter yourself in order to tell these stories, and you have to feel some of that fear.
Yes and no. Because, sure, I've been in places that were dangerous, in war zones and things like that, but, it's all relative. It feels irrelevant. And I have not been asked to do things. I've been unasked to do things, whatever. It just doesn't seem that significant. To me, the question of courage, that question of when one has the courage and what is the courage, has been one that I live with all the time. I remember being in Nicaragua right after the war, and a woman who was a feminist leader there who had fought in the war talked about leaving her 5-year-old daughter and saying, "I'm going for all the children of Nicaragua." And this was many years ago, and I thought, could I do that? Would I be able to do that? And I was so struck in the film by that moment at the end with his wife when she says, "Stay here with your family. Stay here, be with your family." And he doesn't answer, but he has no choice, right? And I think the poignancy and the truth of that complexity of that conflict, and sometimes you don't have a choice, right? She didn't have a choice to say, "Stay here with your family," and he, without words, but with his camera, well, with words, with the narrative. And I just want to say also, that narrative, I mean, when we're talking about this film and films and art and resilience, for me, his voice and the words and the way he expressed, along with the stunning visuals, will be. I mean, I kept trying to write in the dark. So what he was saying, they were just so exquisite and brave and vulnerable. And to me, though, that's what holds. So my danger is not, there's emotional danger because we all live in our own contexts. And I think that's something worth talking about because wherever you are is where you are. So we're right here, and what do you face every day with what you believe and how vocal you are or physically vulnerable. But I want to hear what you all think.
Yeah, no, I don't have any. I've never had any experience like that where I was trying to tell a story and was stopped. I mean, all I can say. I mean, I think I grew up in Rio, like on literally a border of a favela, and I grew up with and witnessing people having their humanity taken away from them and seeing bodies being dumped and things like that. So that's sort of part of my childhood, but nothing, I think experiencing that kind of threat to your own life and to the life of the people you love is a very specific trauma, and I can't even get close to it. It's something that you either experienced or not, I believe. And
I think just for time purposes, we have about 10 more minutes, and we want folks in the audience to be able to engage with the panelists. I have 2 more questions, and I think that goes to what you were speaking about earlier in terms of what type of support and resources can be shared with educators. How can we address in our classrooms topics as heavy as these? A lot of the times we face issues in terms of what the administration wants us to share and what we can't actually share, or issues in terms of ourselves, our own baggage, and not having all the tools or the information to address these issues. What do you think we could do as educators to address these issues in our classroom and even with our colleagues?
Yeah, this is obviously a hugely polarizing issue where just being Palestinian is an issue for a lot of people. And I have been in the classroom with this topic with a doc I did a long time ago that was just about Palestinian identity, and I was surprised about the resistance I was sometimes met with. So I know I give Tribeca a lot of credit and Clonia for going in with this film because I think it's strong and it touches on so many issues remotely as well. Apartheid, racism, colonization. I mean, it's all there for the eye to see, and it connects with so many other causes and struggles. So I think because it's polarizing, one of the things I would want to encourage the students is to start thinking for themselves, because this issue is fed in the media very strongly. And there is already a strong narrative and strong images. And I think we're not introducing an issue, we're almost countering the story that's already told. And I think that's true for things like Ferguson. I think that's true for a lot of cases. And I think the best thing we can do with a film like this is to get the students to really think for themselves or ask really hard questions, because obviously we don't have answers. But to really ask hard questions and connect the dots, connect the struggles. Those images, we see everywhere. And I think to kind of connect big picture things and get them asking the hard questions and really just being open and vulnerable, because we might face some resistance on something like this.
No, I think that the other big message here is collaboration. It's sort of like, I think that I was telling, some of my colleagues here that the collaboration that Guy and Ahmad had in this film wasn't easy, and they sacrificed a lot in order to sort of do something together. There's also a lot of skepticism on the ground in terms of another Palestinian and Israeli collaboration. What will that change? Why doing, sort of, are we confusing arts with politics? But the real message is that I think together and sort of we can build bridges, and sometimes maybe a challenge that I think a lot of Americans or American students have is to sort of think outside of themselves, or to think collectively, to think that maybe with other people that don't have their same perspective on issues, they can build something that is larger than their own, point of view. I think Guy Davidi, Guy Davidi, the Israeli filmmaker, he wrote the narration in this film with the help of with Ahmad, but it's mostly Guy's, and it's really an Israeli person putting, himself in the place of a Palestinian and sort of thinking about that person's existence and life and day-to-day struggles. So to sort of, also challenge people to put themselves into someone else's shoes. I think that's a big step.
There was a universal thought I had watching this film again tonight. Was just when when his son and him were fixing the car, and it was that moment of him losing his innocence. And I think that's a universal factor, and I was like, that would be an interesting prompt for the students, is to talk about a time where, is it like Santa Claus isn't real kind of a moment? Like, at what moment do you feel you lost some of your innocence? Because I think we've all experienced that. And for this kid, it happened at 3 or 4 years old, unfortunately.
Which was basically what my next question was going to be. What topics or issues do you think are relevant in making those connections? We made a clear connection earlier from the beginning, from the process of planning this, when we spoke about Palestine and Ferguson and the whole process of militarization, right? But what other ways can we connect struggles like the conflict in Palestine, the occupation in Palestine, and what's happening in our communities today?
I think that kids do that, given a chance, that because when their stories come out, and when they are encouraged to challenge assumptions and to really hear each other, whoever they are in a particular space, they find the ways in which they are related. And maybe it's the job of the adults is to kind of help illuminate certain parts that aren't automatically illuminated or that have been covered up. But I think they do that quite beautifully.
Is Carla around? I think we're gonna open it up to the folks now with questions or comments that you have in regards to the film, or questions to the panelists. Does anyone have?
I'll pass the microphone around.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a lady right there.
Do you have it?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Cynthia. I really enjoyed the film a lot, and one particular moment that really struck me was it was a scene of Gibril. He was watching a bunch of men kill a goat, and in the narration, he said that, not Gibril said, Imad said that something like he wants to protect his children, but sort of the best way of doing that is sort of not dangerously, but like letting them be exposed to these things so that they understand how vulnerable life is. And that really, really struck me. That's probably the message, one of the biggest messages that I took away from this, because of how much it does apply to human life all over the world, and not just in conflict zones, which I think could be a powerful tool in schools, especially in American schools, dealing with issues that necessarily aren't even explicitly violent. The whole thing of how much should a child be, sort of protected versus exposed in terms of their own development as a person. So I thought that was really interesting.
My name's Matt. I've studied this conflict throughout my since high school career, and I'm a public high school teacher, and I'm also a soldier in the U.S. Army, and it's very disturbing to see. And I think one of the most disturbing images I saw was when the soldiers come to arrest Ahmad. And when they're reading the warrant, that soldier is completely out of his depth. And you can tell he's not a regular soldier. He's most likely a citizen soldier. He's probably doing his term of service. He's reading off the script, arresting someone, and then he raises his weapon with no muzzle awareness into Ahmad's face to get the flashlight at the end of his rifle so he can read the piece of paper. Soldiers are not police. They're infantry soldiers. They are not police. They should not be there. Well, first of all, the bogus charges, all of that aside, it was very truly disturbing to see a soldier raise his weapon into a person's face. It just, that really struck me as truly, truly disturbing. You're out of your depth, and what are you doing there? I mean, Phil being struck by the bullet, yes. I mean, obviously those things are truly disturbing. But I think that moment in and of itself, from my perspective, was one of the most disturbing. In front of his children, someone pointing the muzzle of the weapon into his face. And it's obviously right there. Now, I didn't get the sense that these soldiers were doing anything but what they were told. And that's disturbing myself. And lastly, another image that really stuck to my mind is when they've arrested someone, his hands are behind his back, they stand him up and shoot him. That's against every convention. And if this is called war, then those soldiers should be brought up on international charges, crimes against humanity. You shot a soldier. You shot a person that was protesting that was unarmed. That's truly disturbing to me.
I just want to respond to that really quickly because I think this is often viewed as a war, and I think that word is not relevant. I don't think it's a war. And I think when we're approaching it in the classroom, that's something that I want to be very aware of as well, because war to me is awful, but very different than what this is. Yeah.
I guess in the classroom as well at high school, right? When you're talking about what's happening there and all the violations on every level, is that there's a foreign policy question, which is that the U.S. is paying for this, that we send more money to Israel than any other country in the world. And that is something that, although it's known, I mean, it's not a mystery, it's very often left out of the conversation.
I think it's also important, connecting it back to Ferguson, when we see the militarization of police.
Right.
Obama, in 2011, gave $500 million worth of military arsenal to police all throughout the United States of America. That's alarming, because you're giving military weapons to folks that aren't trained to use it, and we saw it in Ferguson. Carla went there, where folks were saying, well, there's smoke bombs. There were tear gases being thrown at 6-year-olds. Okay, and so we have to talk about domestic policy and foreign policy when we talk about the issue of Palestine.
I just want to add something, because I think we have to remember that military service in Israel is mandatory. And that's why films like that are important, and more so youth education, because when you have mandatory military service and then an apartheid, a sort of segregation policy, you have Israeli kids that have no idea. Like that guy David was telling me that he showed this film to Israeli kids, and they had no idea that this is how Palestinian kids and people were living. Like literally, they know more about Brooklyn and Paris than they know about Palestine. And one of the things that he was fighting for, and one of the things that the Oscar nomination helped him do, was that it sort of forced the Israeli government to really include this film in curriculum in their cultural program that they have, which they hadn't even considered doing it before. And I don't know if it actually became part of the official program, but Guy Davidi ended up raising some money to take this film to children and to just literally show them, what other children like them are living just around the corner from them. So when you sort of put those pieces together, you know, that those are the kids that 2 years, 1 year from now are going to have to go to the military and are going over there. Now they know. Now they, you know, they have an idea of what they're going to be dealing with, because I think you were very, you know, your observation was very poignant and right on. Like, they had no idea where they were and what they were doing and how to interact. It was this sort of very alienating contact, and it shouldn't be. Their neighbors.
Unfortunately, they're the ones training those military are the same ones training the U.S. Police forces as well. They train Ferguson chiefs, so it's global. Yeah, it's systematic.
So my name is David, and the point that I had was, even as, I don't know, as disheartening and, you know, enraging as this film can elicit those kind of emotions in us, I think it's an opportunity for a moment of empowerment in the classroom. So specifically when you're taking it to your high school students, in an age where even adults in the theater, you know, take out their phones when there's images of death in front of us. How do you keep the attention of high schoolers? So again, finding ways to parallel it to their lives, especially in communities, yes, like a Ferguson, like in Oakland, like a Southside Chicago, like a Harlem, and keep going on and on and on. These people in this situation feel like they don't have a voice, or feel like they don't have land, literally, or right, you know, basic human rights. Parallel that with them, and then maybe you can turn it into an initiative, because TFI, you know, through film is a great way to do this. But turn it into an initiative where you're brainstorming ways to, I don't know, you know, brainstorm ways to specifically get your voice out, or specifically how can we turn the camera, maybe even literally, on authority figures in our community without obviously them getting beat down or anything like that. But I think it's an opportunity, taking it back into the classroom for moments of empowerment if you scaffold it effectively and also apply it directly to their lives, because I think it will increase the buy-in, which is where, obviously, as one of you said earlier, the film itself does its job, you know, as it should. A great work of art should do its job, and it does. But in order to communicate it to those who either may feel it's not approachable or over their head or not at all related to their lives, I think there are plenty of opportunities for us in this room as educators to apply this in the classroom.
Anyone wants to say something? We're going to wrap up.
I agree with you. I just think also that for when young people have the opportunity to connect with one another, it's meaningful, and so many things break down. And sometimes in working with young students, when they are moved by something they experience and empathy is engaged, I suggest to them that they, for example, write letters to the people in the film, ask questions, imagine, try to imagine what, even if the exchange isn't pragmatically possible, try to imagine that kind of exchange. And they do exist, these exchanges, they're difficult, but they do exist. And I think that's one way to open and kind of a live engagement with what is it like.
One of the things that I feel is important to raise is that there is the aspect of resistance as a form of self-preservation. And that is something that we should bring up in classes, and it's something that we should bring up in our families and in our communities, that as a people, we have a right to exist. And when that right to exist is threatened, we have the right to defend ourselves. And it's a tough message at times, something that people don't want to hear, but I relate it back to, again, Ferguson, not only Ferguson, but also Brooklyn with Kamani Gray, the young man that was murdered. You had an entire community of young people that came out and said, we're not going to take this anymore. You're not going to kill another black man in our community. And that's good. That's what should be happening. When we become numb to these things, then something's wrong. when we think it's normal, then something's wrong. And as educators, as parents, as sisters, as brothers, as community members, we have a responsibility to use all our mediums for the safety of our community. And I want to thank TFI for using their medium and resources to bring us together to have this type of conversations with, I think, there are many other conversations that we should be having along the way. And I hope we continue to have them. V gave me the signal.
Oh, can I say one thing before we close? It's Bruja.
Hi, Bruja.
Just because I think there was one thing that I think we did miss, and I do want to talk about gender, in specific with the women that we saw who were also there on the front lines. And I want to bring it to this quote that a good friend of mine, who's actually in the front of the stage, wrote on her Facebook, that how we treat the earth is intrinsically tied to how we treat women. And if we listen to that, we see the images of the olive trees being burned, of the olive trees being taken out. What does that say about how we view the land, how we view women, and how we view the children of the land, the children of the women? So I just wanted to bring all the isms to place.
Thank you, Roja. And I think it's extremely important for you to have brought that into the conversation. There's one thing that I want to share, and I think I can, because V told me that I could, and it's about Ferguson. One small thing, I swear. And it's an anecdote. There was a lady who brought her 5-year-old son to the memorial of Mike Brown. You remember? And one of the things that she was saying is, I want him to know why they killed him. Because this boy is going to grow up to be a black man. And instead of fearing the police, I want him to be empowered to know how to deal with the police. And so, again, in our conversations, everywhere and anywhere, the aspect of fear is this small to the reality of a lot of people who are dying every day. And so fear should not overcome us as much as our responsibility as part of the human race to do what we need to do. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Enjoy your drinks.